it's not a quirky thing that people have, or that, it's not even really a choice for people. It's like being caught in your own worst nightmare. And so I think it's really downplayed, or it's really simplified a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I think that can be really harmful, because people, when they are experiencing OCD, don't recognise it because it's not how they've seen it portrayed.
Hello and welcome to Separate Bathrooms. We would like to acknowledge the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay our respects to the elders, both past and present. My name's Cameron Daddo.
I'm Elle Daddo.
How are you, sweetheart?
I'm good, thank you.
Would you consider yourself a controlling person? Are you superstitious?
No.
Do you have any of those behaviours?
Look, I don't walk under ladders.
Why?
Old wives' tale, thinking that it brings bad luck.
Okay, so you said no, so there's the superstition.
Well, controlling... look, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I am. Well, I don't have a lot of... I don't think of myself, I'm very superstitious. I feel like I have some... There's some superstitions, I guess. I don't walk under a ladder.
Okay.
That is one. I know I don't do that.
I don't usually, because I'm scared I'm going to bang my head. But also, working on film sets too, I don't walk under boom. The microphone is often held at a long distance with a boom that goes across, and I never walk under a boom.
Is that a superstition? Or that's
I don't know. It's just more of a
thing?
safety thing, but I always walk around it.
Right.
Yeah. I do have pre-shot routines in my golf and things like that I like to do, but I don't think I get stuck on them, because often I think I'll do something really well and go, what did I do before it? I did this, I twiddled my glove, I paddled my pant leg, I did this, and then I go to do it on the next shot and it messes up. So I never stay with them for too long.
Yeah. Now, I know where you're going. I know where you're going with this, and it's kind of a segue, but kind of not.
Well, it kind of is, because we're talking with someone who lives with a condition called OCD.
Yeah. Now, normally we have couples in and we love our couples, but we really wanted to bring Penny Moodie in because she's got a lot to share about OCD, and we felt it was a really important topic.
Yeah. So there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald which says these words: it took 23 years for Penny Moodie to find an explanation for disturbing thoughts and repetitive behaviours that had plagued her since childhood, but had been treated purely as anxiety.
Yeah, Penny's written a book about her life, and it's a really candid memoir called The Joy Thief, where she invites the reader into what life is like for those with OCD, beyond the stereotypes of obsessive tidiness or maintaining order or making sure you've got your right things happening for
Pre-shot
a golf
routine.
shot. Yeah.
All right, let's find out more. Welcome Penny Moodie into the bathroom. We've heard a lot about OCD over recent years, and it's almost become this sort of like a throwaway label. We've heard it used to describe many different things and personalities. Can you give us a definition of what OCD is?
Yeah, it's basically the presence of repetitive thoughts or images or urges or feelings that cause a lot of distress in someone, and to deal with that distress you usually develop repetitive behaviours to try to decrease that that distress. And these are compulsive, repetitive behaviours that you feel like you can't really stop.
Yeah, right. What was it for you that you decided this is a book that I need to write?
Well, I mean, looking back, I experienced, the onset of symptoms for OCD about the age of 6 or 7, and I wasn't diagnosed until I was 31. So that's 23 years of living through something that I didn't have a name for. I didn't know it was treatable.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was OCD very clearly. And I realised that this was such a common experience for people. The average sort of gap in time between onset of symptoms and diagnosis is about 9 years. I mean, that's what some research says. Some research suggests it's more like 17 years average.
Oh, okay.
It's just astounding. And so I guess I wanted to write a book that I wish I had, I guess,
Yeah.
as a younger person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're a mum. How old are your kids?
So 6, 3 and 1.
Oh, well done. You're busy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So does OCD go down the leash, so to speak?
It's a good question. There is definitely a genetic component of OCD. Yeah. So it's both sort of biological and learned. But it's not clear exactly how strong that connection is. Like it's not like if you have OCD, your kid's definitely going to get it.
Yeah.
But absolutely there's more chance.
There's a
Yeah.
predisposition. And
Yeah.
is it can be brought on by like a traumatic event or like stress? Is that something that can trigger it, or can it just come on its own?
Yeah, it's there's still kind of a lot that's not really fully understood about
Yeah.
OCD yet, but I think basically there are very much genetic components. So it's been shown in a very recent study at a Queensland university that there are very clear differences in the brains of people with OCD.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and so there's certainly that part of it. But then what tends to happen is that people, like their OCD can be triggered by, or sort of tends to come on or peak at times of upheaval.
Yeah, sure.
Or times of trauma. Yeah.
Which is like
Yeah.
a lot of mental illnesses, isn't it? That can, or mental health issues, that something might already be there, but it can come forth when there has been some other event that can trigger it in a greater way.
Yeah, it can kind of lie dormant for a while, and I think this is a really common experience with perinatal OCD, which I talk about in the book, which is a lot of women experience OCD for the first time, either when they're pregnant or in, the year following the birth of their
Right.
child. It's really quite common.
Is there a connection then with hormones with that?
I think there must be. Yeah. Yep, definitely.
Interesting.
You said you were 6 when you first sort of became aware of it. What made you aware of it at age 6?
Well, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know even that what I was experiencing was kind of that different to what other people might be experiencing. But looking back, I was really worried about my parents dying. That became a really repetitive, fearful thought for me, which is not uncommon. But what I would do is kind of hold myself responsible for their safety. So if they went out for dinner, I would, and we had a babysitter or something, I would have to perform certain behaviours before I went to bed because in my mind that would keep them safe. So that's often called magical thinking OCD. There's no logical connection between the two, the behaviours that I'm performing and the actual outcome. But in my mind, that would keep them safe. So that's how it all kind of started, I guess, for me. And at the time, like I said, I kind of knew it was something that wasn't like I should maybe keep to myself. I was sharing a room with my brother at the time and I'd sort of been doing these things, these rituals quite subtly, I think, but I certainly didn't know it was part of a mental illness, not for a very long time.
Yeah.
There's a lot to take on for a little kid, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
That's
it is.
huge. That's really heartbreaking, actually. And how much impact throughout your life now that you can look back on it has OCD had on your life? Has it stopped you from doing things, or how has it made an impact on your life?
It's had a huge impact on my life. I mean, I think that's why I call it the joy thief, because at times when I was really experiencing really, really bad periods of OCD, I couldn't feel joy. I couldn't feel happiness. I wouldn't let myself feel those things because often with OCD you're trying to you're sort of convincing yourself that you're a terrible person or that you're a dangerous person or, whatever it might be. And that really takes its toll after a while.
Yeah.
And you don't let yourself experience, little moments of happiness. You're so stuck in this loop. And so for me, it just makes me think that I wasn't present for so much of my life, really.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, I realised after I had my first child how important it was to really face this head on and really, because I'd sort of self-diagnosed by that point.
Okay.
But hadn't kind of been able to find the right help, but realising how not present I was with my little baby kind of really set something off in me. And I thought, I can't be this mum. Like, I can't be this mum who sort of locks herself away and tries to think through everything and gets caught in these compulsive behaviours, because he really needs me here. So that certainly kind of, spurred me to get specialist help at that point.
And so that was about 6 years ago then?
Yeah, about 5 or 6 years ago.
And from in those 6 years, how has life been different for you now?
It's been so different. It really has. Everything's changed, really. I mean, it's not to say that the OCD has gone away.
Yeah.
I think it's something that will kind of always be there, kind of sitting in the background. But the fact that it is in the background,
yes,
not right in front of me, is amazing. I started something called exposure and response prevention therapy, which has got a lot of research behind it for OCD, and found a psychologist who has a lot of experience treating OCD, and it just changed everything. I certainly have, long periods of time now where I'm not stuck in these obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviours.
That's fantastic.
Wow. Penny, what are some of the main themes or topics that you cover in The Joy Thief?
So I sort of begin by talking about the different ways that OCD can present itself. So it's often called like the subtypes of OCD. So there are so many different kinds. Like there's, like I talked about, magical thinking OCD, and that seems to be quite common amongst kids who often kids will have these like really complicated bedtime routines. And often the parents get sort of drawn into these because it like will bring the anxiety down in them. And so, parents will often sort of become part of that routine, and, kids are touching wood or got to line their toys up or whatever it might be. But there's always something behind that. There's always some sort of fear behind that. But that's often magical thinking OCD. There's harm OCD, which, you worry that you have the potential, you might hurt someone. Often it's someone you love, or that you might pass on some sort of disease to someone. Often the harm OCD thoughts can really come around, like I said, the perinatal time. If you've got a little baby, a vulnerable little person in your care, the thought of harming them would be the worst thing possible. But that's often how OCD works. It's like, what could be the worst thing that I can think of? And then you start convincing yourself that could actually happen, and that you are maybe, you do have the potential to do something really awful. So that's a really common one. There's, sexual orientation OCD. So if you're straight, you can worry that maybe you might be gay, and then if you're gay, you worry you might be straight. And that all sort of boils down to not a fear of not knowing who you are, I think, or not knowing what you're going to do. And contamination OCD is one that a lot of people think of, I think, when they think of OCD. But it's often not just like washing your hands every now and then. It's like really, constantly trying to decontaminate yourself. And it's often more about not wanting to hurt other people. So it's not often about yourself. It's more like, I don't want to pass on something to someone else, because I was really worried that when I was 8 that I had AIDS, and that I would then pass it on to other people, which is pretty heavy for an 8-year-old.
You had a lot going on in your young head, didn't you?
I did. I know. I know.
Well, I'll ask you this question first, because I actually have a little story to tell after you answer this. But what do you hope that people gain from reading your book?
I think the main thing, look, there are a couple of things. The first thing would be that it's very treatable, OCD.
Yeah, great.
There are proven strategies that really can work. And, I mentioned exposure and response prevention therapy before. That's the big one. So it's exposing yourself to whatever it is that you might be fearing, and then it's trying not to perform the compulsion, because the more you perform the compulsions, the more the obsessions will, come back.
Yep.
And it's not an easy kind of therapy to do. It's really not, and it's important to be doing it with someone who's got experience with it, some sort of clinician. But knowing there's that, knowing there are other things to do as well, like I talk a lot about in the book about self-compassion and how important that is for people with OCD or any mental illness.
Yeah.
But like I said, you've spent so long convincing yourself that you're the worst person. And so trying to bring some real compassion back into the therapy can be really useful. And I talk a lot about medication as well, because for a lot of people it's really a combination of medication and therapy that can be really effective.
Yeah, fantastic.
I think I just want people to be hopeful, because I felt really hopeful by the end of writing the book.
Right.
Oh, that's so
Yeah,
beautiful. Good for you. Well, we were printing out our questions this morning, and our son's boyfriend is with us for a couple of days, and he said, "Are you interviewing Penny Moodie?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, my friend just listened to her on a podcast with your husband.
Yeah.
Are you talking to your husband?
Yep.
And he said, just from that one podcast with you talking to him, he already feels better about his OCD. So there's Lockie's friend has got OCD. So just wanting to let you know that even just that conversation has already made a difference for this young man. And he hasn't even read your book. He's going to get your book. But I just think those they're so important to know that, you're going to make a huge difference with this, because I think a lot of people will recognize themselves, I'm sure, in the pages, and know, as you've said, that there's hope, there's ways to change, and that there's a way out of that thinking, if you can apply what you're talking about. So congratulations to you.
That's really lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, you're
Thanks
welcome.
for telling me that.
What are some of the most common misconceptions about OCD, and do you deal with those in the book?
I do, yeah. I do talk a little bit about them. I think when I talk about why OCD is so commonly misdiagnosed, that's when I go into it. Oh gosh, it's like, where do you start? I grew up watching movies like As Good as It Gets or Matchstick Men, a whole lot of movies where there was these often male characters who were displaying compulsive behaviours, but they were always kind of the same. It was always like being, counting things or lining things up or not stepping on cracks, and that can definitely play out in OCD. But I feel like these shows or, even in books and stories, never really went into the real distress behind what's causing those behaviours.
Right.
So I think a lot of people just see the behaviours and are like, oh, that's a bit of a quirky thing that person's got, or that's, they're being really, they've got to be really orderly or really fastidious. And it's just not what it is. It's not a quirky thing that people have, or that, it's not even really a choice for people. It's like... It's an absolute nightmare. I kind of do explain it as being caught in in your own worst nightmare. And so I think it's really downplayed, or it's really simplified a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I think that can be really harmful, because people, when they are experiencing OCD, don't recognise it because it's not how they've seen it portrayed. And then I think it's the same with a lot of clinicians as well. I think it's changing, but I think a lot of clinicians in the past haven't also had a very good idea of what OCD is either. And often when you have OCD, a lot of the thoughts are quite taboo. They're often quite dark. So when you do pluck the courage up to go and see someone, a professional, it can then be such a huge leap of faith to talk about what's going on in your head. And so you really want to know that person has experience with OCD. But for that to happen, you have to know it's OCD. So it's like this big kind of, I don't know. It's there's so many different parts to that question.
So it sounds to me like you really do need a lot of courage to dive in, and you said it,
curiosity as well.
Yeah, and that leap of faith.
Yeah.
To jump off and go, all right, I got to find out what's going on here.
Because it's one thing, a lot of people throw out the OCD term, like for people who are really exceptionally tidy. Oh, she's just OCD.
David Beckham in his miniseries. The series
So
at the moment.
interesting. Yes, I watched that the other night.
Yeah,
I
right?
know.
In the kitchen? Did you see that episode, that scene? Yeah.
But there's a difference between, like, if he wasn't able to keep it clean, he would be in deep distress. That's more of an OCD thinking rather than like, oh, I just really love this clean. Is that
right?
Is that a difference?
Yeah.
Or
Yes, absolutely. Distress and disability is often what comes into a diagnosis. Yeah, so it's got to either take up a whole lot of your time and or cause great distress. So it was really interesting watching that Beckham documentary. And I mean, it could be very much OCD. It could be obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is a little bit different.
Okay.
But again, you don't see that distress behind it. So it's I'm not sure.
Let me ask you something then. So when I was doing The Sound of Music on stage, every night I would prepare in a certain way. I would get ready. I'd put my suit on. I'd have the Austrian flag there for what I would do. I would always touch it. I always recited the same line to make sure my accent was in the right place and the tone was in the right spot. And some nights I would walk out of my dressing room and I wasn't happy with the way that I did it. I'd be halfway down the hallway to the 5-minute call onto the stage. I'd run back and I'd start it all over again. And at its worst, I must have done it like 3 or 4 times before a show.
are you asking Penny to diagnose you?
Yeah,
Right now?
I'm just going,
Yeah.
is this it? Or is
Dr. Penny.
Dr. Penny?
Dr. Penny.
But because I've often wondered about that with myself, very sensitive, you know,
I think
fragile.
I think what Penny's going to find now, as soon as they find out she's written this book, everyone's going to be like, okay, Penny.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I do
Is
this.
that
So
happening?
this is what's happening.
People coming to you now for treatment or for diagnosis?
I mean, I have had a lot of questions, similar questions. It's really interesting because people often display obsessive behaviours. It's very, very common. And I think generally that probably would have been quite helpful for you, Cam, like doing those things. It would have generally been quite a helpful thing for your performance.
Help me drop in, yeah.
Yeah, whereas I think with OCD, it's generally not helpful. It's going to, it's going to cause much more distress than anything else. And parents often ask this because, it is hard to unpack certain symptoms, especially when you've got a kid that's still developing. And sometimes it's really normal for kids to have a bit of a routine and a bit of repetitiveness in whatever they're doing. But again, it's when it's causing great distress if they can't do it, and it's something that happens over and over again. So it's not just based on a performance or based on a sporting game or something. It's something that kind of infiltrates their life more generally. That's when you kind of realise it's more of an OCD thing.
How has your family responded to having this diagnosis for you? I mean, they grew up with you, they saw your whatever they thought it was, your quirks or whatever. How have they responded to knowing now that you actually have a proper diagnosis?
I mean, I think it's been so helpful for everyone.
Yeah.
Because I talk about this in the book, but one of my main compulsive behaviours was seeking reassurance from my mum. So whenever I was worried about something, or like when I was really worried I had AIDS, I would go to her multiple times a day with different kind of scenarios and be like, oh, would this mean that I could have AIDS? Would this mean that, and she would very patiently answer all my questions and just want me to feel less anxious. But what wasn't known was that was fueling the behaviour. So I think it was really helpful for her to know, even though I was an adult when I was diagnosed, but it was really helpful for her to know that, that's in the long run, it's just not a helpful thing to do, to kind of play into those compulsive behaviours, even though it's such a compassionate thing to do as a parent.
Yeah, right.
So it's really hard being a parent of someone with OCD because ultimately you're going to have to try to help them to stop those behaviours. But I think it was just generally eye-opening for them.
We both had the same thought at the same time.
Sure
I'm sure
is.
you go.
Yeah.
You go.
What would have helped you as a kid? What would have been the best thing for you?
finding a psychologist who had experience treating OCD and going to see them with my parents.
Okay.
Because, your family plays such a big role in treatment with OCD because the therapist can't be there all the time. And often you're playing out these compulsions at home and, parents, it's not like they will, I'm not suggesting that a parent of someone with OCD just completely stops cold turkey and like, no, you're not doing any of these compulsions because that can be really distressing, very distressing for a kid. But I mean, with a professional, if possible, trying to find ways to every now and then, go, look, this is actually your OCD talking. Your OCD is wanting you to do this and we're going to try not to do this one time. And the anxiety will go up. But the more that happens, the more you're creating different neural pathways and eventually that kind of really awful kind of obsessive-compulsive loop will slow down and will stop.
So are you saying that part of the treatment would be to make it something that is separate from you, like you are with OCD rather than I have OCD, or basically there's a Gaelic thing that they were saying that we in English say, I am sick. Whereas the Gaelic people say, I am with sickness, so that you can actually treat the sickness away from yourself, that you are not sick.
Yeah.
And is this the same kind of idea that what you're doing here with, it's the OCD talking?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really important part of the treatment actually is knowing when there's an OCD thought, knowing when it is OCD. But again, like OCD is so cruel that you'll then start doubting. It's called the doubting disease. You then start doubting your diagnosis and be like, but maybe it's not OCD. Maybe I really am. So that can be really tricky, but it is trying to, recognise those patterns and then separating them from yourself. Yeah. Yep.
That's so interesting. We've had other people come on and talk about different mental health challenges, and I know I was just thinking of Osher Gunsberg and talking about his bipolar and his erratic thoughts, but he also gets this thing called hyperfocus, where he can, he wrote his book like in I don't know how many days, like a crazy amount, like it's so fast. Hyperfocus. And that's part of his superpower now.
Yeah.
Does OCD give? Is there any superpower that it also gives you, or is it all just challenges?
Look, every single person I've met who has OCD is like extremely creative and imaginative. Yeah. I think there's certainly that part because you are. I mean, everyone has intrusive thoughts, but you can often just go to the craziest place you can imagine. And if you've got a really wild imagination, you get there pretty quickly. So I often do find that people with OCD are very creative people and, it's trying to harness that in the right way, basically.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and also really, really compassionate people, which is why it's so unfair that they're often the ones who are experiencing the most dreadful thoughts about themselves.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do talk a little bit about some of the silver linings of OCD, but I don't want to kind of condescend people or I don't want to be like, well, at the end of the day, it's really, really awful, and it's like I said, very treatable, but when you're going through it can be an absolute nightmare. Yeah.
Just back to the parenting thing for a second, Pen. What are there signs for parents to look out for with their kids?
Yeah, there are signs. And like I said, it can be difficult to unpick, like anxiety and OCD or even ASD and ADHD. Often it can be really hard to unpack what might be OCD. But yeah, generally if your kid's kind of, and this is hard as well because if your kid's pretty young, it's going to be very hard for them to verbalise the fear that's sitting underneath the behaviours. So for me as a kid, it would have been quite hard to realise what I was doing with holding myself responsible for my parents' safety. So what I did talk to quite a few child psychs, and they did say that even from a young age, 5 or 6 or maybe even younger, you can start asking your kid, if you think that there's real fears behind their behaviours, whatever it might be, you can really start to ask them questions and ask them quite pointed questions, and you're never going to trigger something within them. Like kids are already having thoughts about, often about death or about, quite fearful things for them. So the more you can talk about it, the better. But I guess you're not going to see those fears, but you will see behaviours that they might be doing, and they might be really rigid with those behaviours. So if they can't get out the door without doing a certain amount of things beforehand, and it is causing quite a bit of distress for them, but also the family. That's when you can definitely seek a second opinion. But it is hard. A lot of kids will often try to hide the behaviours as well. So it might be you're noticing that your kid's spending a lot of time in their bedroom, or for my case, I was always in the bathroom. So I was in the toilet trying to think my way out of things. So if you're noticing that they're disengaging a lot, that can also be another clue, I guess.
Yeah. How long have you been married for?
How long have I been married for? 4 years?
4 years. Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So,
Honeymooner. You're still honeymooning.
We've been together about 10 years.
Yeah.
9
Okay.
years. Yeah.
All right,
So
well, maybe not.
he was obviously with you when you had your diagnosis. Is there something that has, for your husband, has there been changes in the way he supports you now that, again, the diagnosis has come through? Or have you been able to give him techniques to say, when I'm doing this, this is what you can do for me? Has that changed for the both of you?
Yeah, it has actually. The best thing we did together was go to see my psychologist.
Okay.
And because she was able to explain OCD to him in a way, for me it was always too emotional. It was really hard to explain it and to get the words out and really convey what I wanted to. And so that was really helpful for both of us, I think, because he then started to kind of recognise when I was trying to seek reassurance from him about something. And he finds it really difficult, as most loved ones of someone with OCD do, but it's really hard for him if I'm going to him, and he does recognise it's probably the OCD, but he knows he shouldn't indulge me with with those reassurances, for example. But I think more generally, he is much more compassionate with just knowing if I'm not very present, if I've kind of disengaged a bit, he can often ask me a question and say, is the OCD playing up, or is, and he actually writes a section in one of the chapters which with, I guess the wisdom that he's gained from this experience.
Yeah, fantastic.
Which hopefully will be helpful. Yeah.
Oh, good for you.
What sort of things does he say to you if he is feeling that the OCD is playing up? What kind of things gets through to get? Yep, I'll just leave it at that.
I guess he just tries to empathise with me. So he'll say this, this must be really, really hard right now, and you must be having a lot going on in your head, and I totally understand. And so just not trying to solve the issue, because he can't.
Right.
He can't solve it. It's just kind of, acknowledging it, I think, and empathising with me.
Yeah, that's really good. So I can imagine a fix-it guy would have real trouble with this.
Yeah, and he is a bit of a fix-it guy.
Mm.
Yeah, and he does find it is really, really hard. It's really hard. But even just that acknowledgement can be really, really healing, I think, and really helpful.
Has he been forthcoming with his own challenges for it? I mean, does he say to you sometimes, I'm having a hard time at the moment, how does he support himself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. He doesn't really. He's not someone to really. I don't know. He worries a lot about other people, so he's rarely going to talk about what's affecting him. I think something that we found really helpful, which I know you guys have talked about, is couples therapy, and sometimes it comes up in those sessions, and then I'm reminded of my behaviour does affect him.
Right.
Of course, but you forget. And then I'm reminded of the fact that it is actually really difficult for him as well. So, yeah, I think that's been useful for us, because you can forget.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's good, and it gets. I mean, I know with Ali and I, it's we're all in this together. You know, it's that. That's the what's that High School Musical? We're all in this together, and you go, okay, what are we working towards? What are we? That's the song that plays in my mind.
Well, that one.
Going, okay, well, what's the problem? What's the issue that we're looking at here? And you kind of go around it like a beach ball, and you look at all the different colours and go, all right, well, we're in this together. And we will solve it together. That helps me.
I mean, do they would your did you say psychologist that you see? Yeah,
Psychologist.
Did she also offer your husband some resources? Are there resources for him as well that can kind of go, okay, here's what we're looking at. This might help you too, to help you, or just help himself, or.
I don't remember any specific resources.
Yeah.
I do remember, I mean, another reason I wrote the book was for people with loved ones with OCD, because it can really explain, you know, what's going on. Because I remember picking up a book when I hadn't been formally diagnosed, but I was pretty sure I had OCD, and it was called The Man Who Couldn't Stop. And it was just like eye-opening for me, and I actually just gave it to Hugh, and I was like, you've got to read this because I can't really explain it, and this might do a better job of it. And so that was another way that he was able to get some more understanding about the nuances of OCD. So, it's I don't remember being pointed in a particular direction, but I spent a lot of time at the end of the book on resources for people.
Okay, great.
So for families or for people with OCD, or, you know, whatever it might be, clinicians, there's a lot more out there now than there used to be, which is really promising.
And the good news is that your book is now a resource. So you have now become, you've written a resource book. So like in 5 years' time when we're talking to someone else, go, Penny Moodie's book.
Just grab that.
That's the resource.
Have you gone out on the international speaking circuit yet? Have they grabbed you for that to talk about OCD? I'm sure there are a lot of companies that would love to have you keynote speak about,
absolutely,
about their OCD.
Are there any, to your knowledge, are there any more recent developments in the understanding or treatment of OCD? Are we coming a long way? Have we made sort of leaps and bounds with it at all?
It's getting there. It's look, I did, this wasn't on the speaking circuit, but I did go to the International OCD Foundation conference a couple of months ago, and it was in the US, and that was eye-opening because there was so much going on. It just seems like they're so far ahead of the game in the US with OCD, with research and treatment. But basically what's happening at the moment is, like, if you take medication for OCD, you're going to be pointed in the direction generally of an antidepressant, which will certainly help. But what is being currently worked on is an actual targeted medication for people with OCD.
Oh, great.
So I have no idea what the timeline is for that, but I just know it's coming. So that's really promising.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
That's great news. How can readers connect with you or access, additional resources for OCD?
Well, something I started a couple of years ago with a friend of mine, Rosie, was a website called soocd.com.au. And we both at the time just felt like there was not much out there, and, it was really disjointed, all this information. And so we basically tried to put a whole lot of information in the one place. And you can also find, treatment options depending on what state you're in Australia. So that could be definitely a first place to go.
Great. Great.
What do you hope readers take away from the book in terms of reducing the stigma around mental health conditions and OCD?
I just want people to feel less shame, I think. There's so much shame that comes up around OCD. And as soon as I started realising there were other people who were in the same boat, that shame kind of started to dissipate a little bit, because I was able to be really compassionate with these people and see them for just really great, lovely, normal people. And that then sort of allowed myself to give myself the same kind of compassion as well. So I think just people knowing they're not alone, that was actually the number one reason I wanted to write it. I wanted people to feel less alone, because I felt really alone a lot of the time in all this. And so I think just knowing that can actually be really cathartic in itself.
Absolutely.
Where can our listeners, where can we find it? We haven't got it either. Where can we get The Joy Thief?
Yeah, look, you can get it all good bookstores. You can get it online. You can get it at Booktopia or Dimmicks or, you basically just type it into Google and it should come up.
Penny Moodie, she's written a book called The Joy Thief. Thank you so much for writing it and then sharing your story. You know, you are brave.
Yeah.
You're a very empathetic person, and this is going to make a big difference for a lot of people. And I think what a beautiful legacy to have, knowing that you've written this book and it's going to be so helpful. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us.
Thanks, Elle. Thanks, Cam.
Thanks, Penny.
So much.
That was fantastic.
I really, really think that book is going to help a lot of people. I really do. And hopefully this podcast will help a lot of people too, to share that amongst people that might really be suffering without really knowing that they've got OCD and that there's help out there because it's so anxiety driven as well. And God knows that there's so much anxiety in the world right now, and that knowing that this is actually something that's treatable, I think that gives so much hope to people who have had that form of thinking.
Yeah.
And, that is no fun way. That just broke my heart to think that a little kid feels that they are keeping their parents alive by lining up their shoes or tapping the wall 10 times or that is that's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's a lot to put on a little kid's shoulders.
Yeah, well, no one's putting it on.
No.
Is just
she's feeling it. Not heaping on her own shoulders.
Yeah, because her parents would of course feel nothing but oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Please don't feel that way.
Yeah.
But that doesn't help that child, which is why getting your child to see someone to break that. Because I know I've done that with our kids when there's been that, you go to try to calm everything down and listen to them and answer the question over and over and over and over again, thinking that you're doing the right thing. But maybe there's more to it than that. What's behind that repetitive questioning?
Yeah.
What's the fear? What's going on? Dig a little deeper and have someone else help with that.
I think it also will help for people who have a late diagnosis as well, because they can read the book and go, oh God, that makes so much sense to me, and then get some assistance.
Yep. And clearly Penny has it's working for her. For her to say she goes quite some time without those OCD thoughts, and she can delineate them as well, which is really important.
Yeah, and she seems to have covered a lot of the bases. I don't know how many bases there are in the silo of OCD, but she seems to have covered a lot. So the book is The Joy Thief. We'll put all that information in our show notes, and hope you liked it. Also, can I ask, when you go to our show notes, you get an opportunity to rate the podcast, and we would love it if you could rate Separate Bathrooms while you're there. Leave a comment if you feel like it, and we just thank you for tuning in to this one and listening so far. You're deep.
This is true. Thanks so much for listening.